Curse you, Bayle!
Before we begin the video, here's a mandatory spoiler alert. This video is a no-holds-barred discussion of a focal aspect of the DLC's narrative, so if you haven't beaten the DLC yet, you should do that and come back to this video afterwards. While researching, scripting, and recording 2 new videos, which, by the way, I think you're really going to love, I stumbled across something that made me drop everything I was doing and pivot completely. While examining the Forge of the Giants, I realized that I'd never quite given it my full attention. I overlooked the Forge in the way that many of us did, even on multiple playthroughs, rationalizing the broken structure, saying it must have been a dragon assault and things of that sort. This video finally explains what happened at the Forge of the Giants and argues that it's better understood as the Cauldron of the Titans, an age-old structure that acted as a divine conduit for whatever outer gods the Titans interacted with, similar to the Divine Gate at Enter Elim. In my view, the Titans used this cauldron to create the ancient dragons. Ultimately, something went wrong, and the Titans needed to repurpose the Forge into a weapon which could disintegrate or smelt the dragons instead of create them. This weapon of disintegration is exactly what we see when Melina acts as divine kindling for the Forge, sending a beam of flame up towards the heavens in the burning of the Erdtree after defeating the fire giant before we go to Farum Azula. While the evidence for some of these claims is not as straightforward as usual, I'm going to try to convince you of some of it with what's available. Dragon Communion, of the original sort, was birthed at the Forge of the Giants. Part of what led me down this line of investigation is that the divine imagery of Farum Azula, the Church of Dragon Communion, and the Grand Altar of Dragon Communion are the same, empty chalices. Like the Albinaurics and the Rippleblade, the dragons are worshipping the symbol of their artificial creation. In order to contextualize this video, let's paint a picture around a question. What does a civilization do the very first time one of their own becomes blasphemous? How do you deal with a completely unknown threat to your existence? Imagine the Titans using the cauldron infused with the fire of their god, likely not the Fel god, but some kind of eternal fire outer god which allowed for the alchemical combination of ancient gravel and gold. They tap into some kind of primordial element or current that literally forges ancient dragons. Perhaps it's Placidusax's god, which would abandon him later, that seduced the Titans into forging the dragons. Whatever the reason, forge them they did, and the ancient dragons were born. Importantly, a primary aspect of the difference between the 4-legged, 4-winged dragons and their 2-legged, 2-winged counterparts the drakes is that dragons are forged, and drakes are born by natural means. Well, as natural as Dragon Communion happens to be. As the Titans forged their dragons, they likely lived in harmony for quite some time. There's no evidence that the dragons rose up against the Titans or went to war with them. We have evidence of other wars in prehistory. If this war occurred, I'd imagine we have something to go off of. This is where things get interesting. We can imagine, as happens time and time again in this world, a dragon-forging titan is seduced by an outer god, which whispers to them to consume a dragon heart and take its power. The titan can't resist, and gorges on the heart of a dragon, committing the very first blasphemy, the first Dragon Communion. I argue that this first Dragon Communion results in a dragon we've all become intimately familiar with since the drop of the DLC, Bayle the Dread. The first of the drakes, decidedly not an ancient dragon. We learn of Bayle's being the result of Dragon Communion from Florisax, Dragon Communion priestess. When we ask her about Egon, she tells us,
I remember that name well, the broken drake warrior, driven by bottomless hunger and fiery ambition. Precisely what the Dragon Lord envisaged for men who partake in Dragon Communion. The mad hunger and fierceness of spirit that only flows from those young and short of sight. He rather reminds me of Bayle. In fact, such thoughts are unfathomable to ones as old as we.
In this dialogue, Florisax also tells us that Bayle is young compared to her and Placidusax. Somewhat paradoxically, however, she also tells us that Bayle is the oldest and vilest of the dragons. How can we make sense of this? Well, he's the oldest of the youngest dragons, and is actually of a completely different species, the drakes. Somewhat akin to the shamans of the Land of Shadow, Bayle's drakes would be systematically slaughtered by the ancient dragons and their human counterparts, the Drake warriors. In fact, she tells us that since he attacked Placidusax,
Bayle and his bloodline, the Drakes, have served as sacrifices for dragon communion.
Like Marika, Bayle was seduced and committed a betrayal against the others who would rule the next age, leading to his becoming Bayle the Dread. We also have further evidence in the unique shape of Bayle's heart. Bayle's heart item description reads, "The biatrial heart of Bayle the Dread, dotted with horn-like gravelstones and glistening with deep red liquor. Gorge upon this at the grand altar of Dragon Communion to absorb Bayle's power, the purest form of communion, in the words of its priestess." So, Bayle is the oldest of the youngest dragons, and the first of his kind to have a biatrial heart, a heart with two atria. The atria of human beings are small, thin-walled chambers in the upper part of the heart that receive blood from veins and then pass it into the ventricles for pumping for the purposes of oxygenation. Bayle has a flesh heart because he needs blood. This is because he's the result of the original Dragon Communion. And this dragon, this Drake, would need to be quelled for his transgressions, and because of the threat he now posed to the harmonious society between the Titans and the ancient dragons. This is when the Forge would need to be turned from a dragon producer into a Drake destroyer. Stone dragons and chains would be added around the exterior, and plans would be set in motion to capture the newly dragonborn Bayle and stick him in the cauldron with the fire that was used to mold those who would become his nemeses. The chains would hold him in, and he'd be smelted to ash. Of course, Bayle is alive and well, but there's nothing left of the Titans but their giant skulls and rib cages along with their architecture. So what happened when Bayle was trapped in the Forge by the Titans? The move from Forge of the Dragons to intended Smelter of Bayle required some re-engineering. In order to make sense of this transition, we need to look very carefully at the state of the Forge when we find it guarded by the Fire Giant. The Forge of the Giants is a prehistoric masterwork of technological prowess in the mountaintops of the Giants. The cauldron is built in the highest point of the lands between, and is freestanding with no need for bracing from any direction. Many people theorize that the chains which drape from it in the current era once helped to brace the Forge, but I argue that this is incorrect. It currently has 3 chains attached to it, 2 hanging and 1 affixed to the edge of the Fire Giant's arena. After we beat the Fire Giant, we use this chain to ascend to the lip of the Forge, making our way around to talk to Melina in order to burn the Erd Tree, and make our way through the impenetrable thorns left by Radagon at its base. On the world map, the Forge is shown as having its 3 dangling chains, 2 major chunks missing from its sides, and a bigger flame than we actually see when we arrive. To me, this says that whoever inscribed the steels where we get our maps in-game marks the world at a certain time, a time long before we actually get there. This explains many consistencies and inconsistencies between the in-game map and the world that we actually traverse. When we arrive, the first thing we notice when going up the chain to the Forge is the smaller of 2 gashes. Then we have to jump up a knotted chain near the rim. As we make our way around the edge, the truly monstrous size of the Forge overwhelms us. When I first saw the damage to the Forge, I wondered what could possibly be big enough to deal a blow like that. Like many others, I assumed it was damage in an assault by dragons, given the timeline of the war between the Fire Giants and the Ice Dragons. Of course, this was back when I thought the Forge of the Giants was, well, a forge that was built by the Giants. But the closer one looks, the less viable that answer seems to be. It is because of dragons, but not because dragons attacked and damaged it. In order to understand the damage to the Forge, we need to examine the chains and the stone dragons around the edge of the Forge very carefully. Firstly, I'm quite sure that the chains and the dragons were added much later than the original building of the structure. Still, I believe they were built by the same people who built the Forge, the Titans. They're oxidized, however, and seem to be made out of a different kind of material than the rest of the Forge. They're also made much more sloppily. These stone dragons and chains were added hastily for a functional reason, not to stabilize the cauldron in place, but to keep something inside of it when trying to burn it. Likely, there was a lid at one point, and no, it isn't what the Fire Giant is carrying when we fight him. It would have been much, much bigger than that. I think that the shield-looking object he wields has something to do with tending the flame, as he's cursed to do for eternity by Marika according to his remembrance, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Given the length of the chains, the lid would have been something of a dome. When put together, it would have been very reminiscent of a thurible used to burn incense. In a way, a thurible is apt, as creating dragons was definitely a divine ritual of a sort. The lid would have been set atop the Forge when performing the ritual to create the dragons, and the chains were added later as a way to secure the lid one permanent time. What I do know is that, when there was no other way to kill Bayle, the Titans decided that he needed to be smelted down. An attempt to smelt him the Titans did. Let's look closely at the forge and see if we can't decipher how it actually got damaged. The stone dragons on the side of the forge are interesting. They actually remind me a lot of Frampt and Koth from Dark Souls 1, mostly because of their teeth, but also because of their expression. This is just a fun observation. The chains and stone dragons are telling a story. When we look at the cauldron from a top-down view, we see that the 3 dragons are in 3 points of a square, but 1 dragon is missing. Where did it go? The 4th dragon would be exactly where the large gash is in the forge. In my view, this dragon was ripped from the cauldron, and I can share more clues as to what happened here, and what the chains were actually for. Remember that the chain we climbed up is awkwardly wound around the stone dragon we need to platform to reach the lip of the forge. How does a chain of that size get wound around a big stone dragon? Well, easy. The chain went over the top of the forge and connected to the dragon that used to be on the other side of the cauldron. When we look at the chain that's wound around the dragon, we see something amazing. The end link that goes into the dragon is circular, but every other chain link has 2 holes, one for the previous link and one for the next link. If that chain is intact, we should be able to follow all of the 2-holed links down to the end, where we should find another circular link. And this is just what we find. This chain is completely intact. It's a control variable that we can use to measure the other chains for length, damage, and the like. So what about the other 2 chains? Each chain is still connected to its dragon at the top of the forge, circular end link intact. But they both fall short of being a full chain, each missing the other end. And when we count the 2 chains which are snapped in half, we get about 35 links. When we carefully count the intact chain, we see approximately 36 links. Whatever happened, the 2 chains which are split lost a link in the process, and the other chain, instead of snapping, pulled the stone dragon from the edge of the forge. This was the first damage that was dealt to the forge. After all, the forge wasn't designed for pressure cooking dragons, and especially not at the scale it was being used when it exploded. We can imagine that the dragon was ripped off with incredible force, while the other chain, which went over the top of the forge, was snapped in half. The intact chain would have whipped over the other side, and wound around the other dragon head once, whipping back into the forge, skewering the sides in a circular motion. And that's just the kind of damage that we see inside the forge. Then it would have swung back out, wound around again, and slammed into the other side of the wall, leaving another massive gash in the side opposite its original anchored position. Once these 2 major pieces of damage have been done, the chain winds around the dragon one more time, slamming into the mountain and getting lodged into the ground, where we later find it and use it as a bridge to ascend the forge. The evidence is clear. The cauldron turned from a forge into something of a pressure cooker, ready to explode. When it did, it hurled volcanic-style ash and stone into the lands between, killing the Titans and leaving pocks in their skulls and bodies where they were assaulted with flying, hardening volcanic rock. It would have covered their lower bodies and the rest of the mountaintops with lava. This lava would have flown throughout the lands between, causing cataclysmic damage and bringing the Age of the Titans to a swift end. It would have polluted their skies and covered the sun. Maybe the mountaintops of the giants didn't used to be the icy hell that we know and love. In fact, all of the weather in the lands between could easily be a result of the changes this cataclysm brought to the world. That their buildings still stand after this event is a testament to their building prowess. Moreover, this explosion is likely responsible for the distribution of smithing stones across the lands between, and, of course, explains the incredible number of smithing stones in the Land of Shadow, given its proximity to the forge. The dragon scale inside would have been vitrified, as we see on the edge of the mountains and throughout the lands between. If anything, it's highly likely that this was the catastrophic event that gave way to the age of the ancient dragons, as dragons with single atrial hearts would be just the kinds of beings that could survive in such a world. Well, them and magma-breathing drakes. The cause of this is clear. Bayle the Dread was stuck inside the newly engineered forge, complete with its chains and stone dragons, and sealed away to be burned for his transgressions against his kind. Unfortunately for the Titans, and for Placidusax, Bayle the Dread is not one to be burned. Leaning on his newfound strength, he likely added to the pressure inside the forge, casting what's now known as his infamous incantation, Bayle's Tyranny. Bayle's Tyranny item description states, one of the greatest Dragon Communion incantations, harnesses the fearsome power of Bayle the Dread, channels the form of the Dread Dragon to emit a mighty roar accompanied by a heatwave burst, causing violent eruptions of fire in the area. Even after being consumed, the throbbing heart of Bayle continues to resist its subjugation, never weakening. One day, the fire within will consume the very body and soul of its communion devourer. One day. The captain chained forge would have already been building immensely in pressure from trying to cook Bayle, but Bayle searches deep within himself, harnessing his fearsome power, and roars, causing violent eruptions of fire. Bayle's heart resists subjugation by the Titans and the ancient dragons, sending the remnants of the smithing of dragons flying across the lands. Although the architecture of the Titans stands, all of their buildings are covered in vitrified stone, as we see on the Divine Towers. This is so important, it's even included in their in-game map icons. I speculate that after the Forge acts as a supervolcano, these structures must be able to resist the fire that burns everything away. This is specifically true of the Forge. At some point, the Fell God embeds themselves in the eternal flames which remain in the cauldron, and the fire giants in their primitive splendor come to worship the Fell God, taking on its aspects into their bodies. Then, thousands of years later, after they banish the ice dragons, they're warred against by the Erd Tree, leaving our single fire giant for us to find at the base of the Forge, tending eternally to the flame of ruin. This shows that this practice, akin to the jarring of the shaman from another cycle yet to come, led to the creation of Bayle, which caused a major cataclysm in the land, ending the Age of the Titans and beginning the Age of the Ancient Dragons. But the birth of Bayle also saw the birth of a current which would yet have its day, the Crucible. Then, thousands of years later, another seduction and betrayal would occur, leading to the birth of Gold and Shadow, and the Age of the Erd Tree. As the Memory of Grace states, it's merely a cycle. Stand before the Elden Ring, become the Elden Lord. This is what Placidusax did, what Godfrey did, what Radagon did, and what we'll do time and time again as we approach the burned thorns of the Erd Tree. What we can draw from this cycle is that Placidusax's Elden Ring was likely shattered in his fight with Bayle, leaving the Age of the Dragons open for usurpation by the Age of the Crucible. This would explain why so many aspects of the Crucible are dragon-coded. The continual themes of jars, crucibles, as forgers of not only characters of the story, but of history itself, is so incredibly deep and powerful. Such a simple motif has generated a story that continues to baffle us even 2 years later. So, next time you climb the jagged peak and head for Bayle's arena, who will you see? A downtrodden beast, cursed to walk on his belly? Or the determiner of ages past, whose fury and desire to live literally burn the world?
Bayle the Dread! You shall haunt me no longer! Bayle.
If you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.